Hey Wapters, Mr. Lassiter here to finish off our lecture from today's class. So this is going to be kind of how it is from now on. You got to catch up. We're going to be looking at Africa. We're going to be looking at changes and exchanges that occur in Africa. And we're going to be talking about abolition and development of legitimate trade in Africa. So this is where we were earlier in class today, and this map I showed you on the board here. It's a little bit more visible. You have it in your book as well. I think it's pretty good considering what we're going to be discussing, which is the end of slavery and the development of other trade routes, and talking about things that were traded, especially palm oil. On this map you see it's got these arrows that shows kind of the exportation of slaves that occurred from Africa to other areas, and in that region you have a year, so about 1820 here, about 1855, 1820, 1850. That tells you the year that the slave trade was oppressed there. So you'll see this map again. It's also in your book, slightly different, but still very good. So let's get talking about this. In 1808, or by 1808, we see that news of slave revolts like we saw in San Domingue or Haiti, and the activities of abolitionists who were trying to end slavery combined to lead Britain and the United States to prohibit their citizens from participating in the slave trade. This is not an outlawing of slavery, but instead is an outlaw of the slave trade. The United States, for example, would still have an internal slave trade because slavery was hereditary. So despite not being able to bring slaves from Africa to the United States, legally mind you, there was still a growth of slavery here. The British tended to use their navy in order to stop this slave trade. But there was still a continued demand for slaves, especially in places like Cuba and Brazil, which we've talked about before. And this meant that the slave trade really doesn't end until the late 1860s. But of course, as the slave trade declines, and that of course being a source of funding or money or whatever for African kingdoms that participated in the slave trade, Africans then turned to expand their legitimate trade. And most of the time this was in gold or other raw materials. Anything that we consider legitimate trade is basically exports other than slaves. On the Gold Coast, for example, as they turned to gold, exporting gold, exports of gold climbed to nearly 25,000 ounces in the 1840s and 1850s, compared with only 10,000 ounces in the 1790s. So it basically goes up by 250% when they are not exporting people. The most successful new export, though, was that of palm oil, which was exported to make soap and candles and other lubricants as needed. And it was usually exported to the British manufacturers. Now, before we move on, I want to draw your attention right here to where my mouse is. This city, which will basically become a city-state of Opobo, here at the delta of the Niger River in southern Nigeria. So keep that in mind as we go to this next slide. The increase of the export of palm oil is going to alter social structures in that region. This is demonstrated very much in the career of a slave who you see pictured here, Jaja of Opobo, who becomes a very wealthy palm oil trader in the 1870s. Basically, he rises from slavery to become the head of a major canoe house where, that was responsible for trading these things. And he founded a new port city, basically, Opobo, which he ruled as a king, a king of a city-state, so to speak. And he became the greatest palm oil trader in the Niger Delta. In fact, he opposes the British when they try to assert that Opobo is a British territory. He refuses to pay them taxes. Ultimately, he is kind of taken, forced to pay these taxes. He actually visits England at one point. Eventually, he dies. Most likely, it could have been poison, and he. When he dies, basically the city-state of Opobo declines. But under his leadership, it was a very important palm oil trading city. Anyways, that's a long story there. But nevertheless, that's what it is. The suppression of the slave trade also helped spread Western cultural influences into West Africa. So as Europeans, especially the British, were looking for, as they end the slave trade, they begin trading more with different, in different materials. Missionaries also convert many Africans in these areas, especially around the coastal areas. They found schools for recaptives who the British had settled in Sierra Leone. And so they begin to have kind of a huge influence that way. If you watch the John Green video, which I'm going to link for you as well, it will talk quite a bit about Nigeria and how southern Nigeria was majority Christian, whereas northern Nigeria was mainly Islamic. And the reason being because of the British settlement and trade in that area. Also, in Liberia, Black Americans brought Western culture to West Africa as they set up a free and independent Republic of Liberia, which was, as your book says, it was a place of liberty at a time when slavery was legal and flourishing in the United States. So basically it became like a free republic. Still a country there today. Of course, the last little bit from this section is about secondary empires in Eastern Africa. And I mentioned this to you in class today, how we kind of have our primary large empires that begin producing for themselves. Whereas secondary empires, we call them this because they depended on the Western demand for ivory and other goods and on Western manufacturers for weapons. Basically, they're secondary empires because they would not exist without trade with Europe. Anyways, so these start to pop up when the British patrols end the slave trade on the Atlantic coast. Slave traders in the Atlantic begin to instead purchase their slaves from East African markets that had traditionally supplied slaves to North Africa and the Middle East. So where the slave trade had ended, it kind of just shifts to different areas. Zanzibar Island and neighboring territories ruled by the Sultan of Oman were important in the slave trade during this time period too, as well as the ivory trade and then the cultivation of cloves on plantations, and they used slave labor. Along the East Coast, there was a demand for ivory, which allowed African and Arab merchants to hundreds of miles inland to build large trading empires. So basically what we're seeing here is a change in the structure of trade. On the west coast of Africa, where slave trade becomes outlawed, they turn to other things like palm oil. The slave trade market then shifts to East Africa for a time, but the ivory trade and other materials become much more important. And because a lot of this comes from the interior of Africa, we see people moving further and further inland in Africa instead of just relying on coastal cities. Anyways, so historians refer to these as the secondary empires for the reasons we've talked about, and Egypt's expansion southward in the 19th century, which you saw on your map, their expansion into Sudan, that also could be considered a secondary empire as well. Basically, he had invaded Egyptian Sudan in order to secure slaves for his army, and that's about it. I got nothing else to say. I'm kind of out of words today. Nevertheless, get these in your notes. Ending with the whole in mind, this is what we started the lecture with. We'll return to this as well. Keep in mind that there was exploitation of weak regions, for example, South Asia, Africa, and South Pacific, although really we just talked about Africa today. This was political, military, and economic. But this region of Africa was not powerless. There were vibrant cultures. There were local initiatives, which we talked about. We saw how leaders defied European countries like the British. Here, our example at the beginning of the day was India, but we just talked about Opobo, the city-state, which was defiant. And that, yes, they did use European education, technology, and methods to transform their society and challenge power in the West. So keep that in mind today. That's about it. And come ready to learn tomorrow, ready to work. We got a busy, busy week. I will also, well, that's it. I'm done. Y'all have a great day. Y'all are probably tired of hearing me anyways. See you later.